They escorted Brandon Hayes off the executive suite on the 47th floor at precisely 5:20 p.m. on a rain-slicked Tuesday. His leather briefcase was clutched in his trembling right hand, his tailored designer suit wrinkled, and his once unshakable swagger entirely shattered. The entire downfall of a 36-year-old chief executive officer who believed he was untouchable had unfolded in less than 3 hours. And remarkably, it all began with a simple, polite handshake that he arrogantly refused to return in front of the entire board of directors. My name is Raymond Vance. I am 55 years old, and I spent 32 years of my life building Apex Core Technologies from a cramped 12-person garage enterprise in downtown Chicago into a $3 billion global industry leader. When we started back in 1991, we had 6 hardware engineers and 6 assembly technicians working out of a rented industrial bay next to an old rail yard near the Chicago River. We spent our first 3 winters huddled around kerosene heaters while soldering custom server backplanes for local Midwestern logistics firms. We survived the devastating dot-com crash of 2000, when half our competitors folded overnight, expanded our enterprise footprint through the turbulent post-9/11 economy, and secured our place as the primary backbone infrastructure provider for Fortune 500 financial institutions across North America and Europe. I mortgaged my family home during the severe liquidity crisis of 2008 just to meet payroll for 40 engineers who depended on me to feed their families, cover medical bills, and keep their mortgages paid. I flew into Detroit during a blinding blizzard in 1991 to personally deliver custom circuit boards. When our main competitor's manufacturing facility caught fire, establishing our reputation across North America for ironclad reliability, relentless customer devotion, and absolute human integrity, I surrendered my personal weekends, sacrificed sleep, and poured my sweat into every foundational brick of this organization. 5 years ago, when I stepped down from the active role of Chief Executive Officer to assume the position of Senior Strategic Advisor and retain an 18% voting stake on the board of directors, I recognized that the enterprise needed fresh energy to stay competitive in the fast-evolving digital landscape. But I also possessed enough hard-earned wisdom to understand that raw ambition without human decency is a prescription for corporate catastrophe. To protect the 5,000 employees who trusted us with their livelihoods, I engineered airtight legal safeguards into our governance bylaws, safeguards that arrogant successors would never notice until those legal mechanisms snapped shut around them like a steel jaw. The high-stakes meeting that Tuesday morning was scheduled to approve an $850 million acquisition of our primary competitor, CloudNet Solutions. On paper, the acquisition was designed to consolidate our market footprint and position Brandon Hayes as a brilliant corporate visionary. Brandon was 36 years old, held a Harvard Master of Business Administration degree from the class of 2011, and had spent 18 months as Chief Executive Officer. He had been brought aboard by aggressive activist hedge fund board members who wanted immediate stock price surges regardless of long-term operational stability. Brandon approached business with the reckless disdain of someone who believed that history began the day he received his diploma and that anyone over 45 was obsolete cargo, slowing down his sleek digital express train. In his very first company town hall 18 months ago, he had instituted ranking systems that pitted junior developers against senior engineers, openly mocking veteran workers as legacy liabilities during internal executive stand-ups. When I walked into the glass-walled board conference room that morning, I smiled warmly and extended my hand across the polished mahogany table toward Brandon. The room was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling panoramic glass windows overlooking the stormy, gray expanse of Lake Michigan. High-definition wall cameras blinked steadily with subtle red indicator lights, broadcasting our proceedings live over an encrypted investor stream to institutional portfolio managers across North America and Europe. It was a standard gesture of professional respect among colleagues. Brandon looked down at my outstretched hand as though it were a piece of contaminated garbage. He let out a sharp, audible scoff that echoed off the acoustic wall paneling, then cast a condescending glance around the room to invite the younger staff members to join in his mockery. "We do not need to engage in this old-school networking ritual, Raymond," Brandon said loud enough for every board member, and recorded audio monitor to capture clearly. "The modern corporate environment is driven by data-driven outcomes and ruthless algorithmic efficiency, not outdated glad-handing and sentimental handshakes." The boardroom froze instantly into uncomfortable silence. Harrison Miller, our board chairman and my trusted colleague of 25 years who had stood beside me during our 1998 initial public offering, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. Sarah Jenkins, our brilliant chief financial officer who had managed our balance sheet through 2 major recessions, dropped her pen onto her notebook. Victor Bradley, a retired federal appellate judge who served as an independent director, along with Evelyn Carter, Douglas Ross, and Cynthia Brooks, all watched the interaction with palpable tension. I did not withdraw my hand immediately. I held it steadily in midair for 3 deliberate seconds, allowing the red light on the wall-mounted livestream camera to capture every millimeter of his dismissive body language. Under our mandatory governance guidelines, established after major Delaware corporate legal reforms, all full board sessions were broadcast live on an encrypted stream for major institutional investors and pension fund managers to review executive transparency. Brandon had just broadcast his absolute lack of basic human courtesy to the very shareholders who held the financial keys to his corporate kingdom. "Fair enough, Brandon," I said softly, withdrawing my hand with calm dignity and taking my seat at the end of the mahogany table. "Let us proceed to your data-driven presentation." Brandon smirked, convinced he had asserted total dominance over the old guard. He picked up his wireless presentation remote, adjusted his silver cufflinks, and stepped toward the massive electronic whiteboard. He had no idea that he had just ignited the fuse on a legal and financial minefield that I had spent half a decade preparing specifically for executives of his exact arrogant caliber. Brandon clicked to his opening slide, which displayed glowing graphics, announcing the prospective synergy of the $850 million merger with CloudNet Solutions. For 30 minutes, he recited a rehearsed monologue filled with hypermodern management jargon. He spoke glibly of disruptive optimization, aggressive headcount rationalization, and cloud-native velocity. He presented sleek bar charts, promising a 30% increase in operating margins within 12 months. But as I flipped through the printed appendix of his presentation, my 32 years of operational experience alerted me to glaring operational anomalies that his high-priced external management consultants had glossed over. I raised my index finger calmly. "Brandon, I see here that your strategic plan projects a 15% revenue surge in the second quarter post-merger. However, your integration outline calls for eliminating 80% of CloudNet's senior engineering department within 45 days. CloudNet's top 50 corporate clients include major regional healthcare networks, defense supply chains, and global logistics providers who rely upon custom high-touch service-level agreements. CloudNet operates 52 custom data center clusters across 30 states that rely entirely on senior engineers who spent 15 years building proprietary hardware abstraction layers. Those senior engineers hold the proprietary domain knowledge for CloudNet's legacy architecture. Have you conducted a formal audit of customer retention risks associated with terminating those key technical liaisons?" Brandon let out a heavy, exasperated sigh, resting his palms on the edge of the conference table and leaning forward with patronizing intensity. "Raymond, with all due respect to your historical contributions, customer retention in the 21st century is determined by algorithmic value delivery, not personal relationships. The legacy engineers you are worrying about are overpaid over 45 liabilities who represent legacy thinking. We are stripping away the deadweight so our agile teams can scale." Sarah Jenkins, the chief financial officer, cleared her throat nervously. "Raymond raises a critical accounting concern, Brandon. CloudNet's top 50 enterprise clients generate 60% of their annual recurring revenue, and those contracts are explicitly anchored by high-touch engineering support teams. If we terminate those senior technical leads without proper knowledge transfer, those clients have unilateral cancellation clauses triggered by service degradation. Under our board oversight rules, ignoring those SLA triggers violates our duty of care. Brandon waved his hand dismissively at Sarah. We have run the predictive modeling through our external advisory algorithms, Sarah. The client churn parameters are fully hedged. We cannot allow emotional nostalgia for legacy employees to derail an $850 million deal. Nostalgia? I asked quietly, looking Brandon straight in the eye. You call 3 decades of building ironclad client trust and protecting technical integrity emotional nostalgia? That is precisely what it is, Raymond, Brandon replied sharply, his composure slipping into open hostility. The business world has moved past the era where senior executives waste time building personal rapport over coffee. We operate on metrics, speed, and market disruption. If you cannot adapt to modern velocity, perhaps you should consider stepping down from your advisory role entirely. The boardroom fell into a suffocating silence. Even the HVAC ventilation hummed with newfound tension. Harrison Miller leaned forward, his brow furrowed deeply. Brandon, that tone is entirely unacceptable and inappropriate. Raymond founded this enterprise and established the foundational client trust that pays for the very presentation remote in your hand. I appreciate your defense, Harrison, I said, raising my hand gently to restrain my old friend, but Brandon is entitled to express his management philosophy. However, management philosophy must comply with governing corporate law and statutory regulations. I opened my weathered leather briefcase and extracted 3 blue-bound legal folders. I slid one across the table to Harrison, one to Sarah, and kept one in front of me. Brandon glanced at the documents with mild annoyance. What are those? Brandon asked, adjusting his posture. Are those more archival historical documents? These are active regulatory compliance audits and corporate governance bylaws, I replied smoothly. Let us discuss your planned elimination of 300 senior technical employees across our combined facilities. Your presentation notes state that these mass layoffs will take effect 48 hours after the closing of the transaction. Did your legal counsel inform you of the statutory requirements under the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, commonly known as the Warren Act, under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101? Brandon blinked, a slight flicker of hesitation crossing his eyes before he quickly masked it with renewed bravado. The Warren Act applies to permanent plant closures and massive unannounced workforce reductions. Our legal advisors structured these as individual performance-based separations using automated scoring algorithms. Then your legal advisors lied to you or committed severe professional malpractice, I stated firmly. Under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101 et ECE, attempting to mask a mass layoff of over 50 full-time workers behind fabricated performance reviews to evade the mandatory 60-day statutory advance notice requirement constitutes a deliberate federal statutory violation. It exposes this corporation to double back pay penalties, mandatory healthcare benefit restitution, and statutory civil fines of $500 per day per violation. You are exposing Apex Core Technologies to over $40 million in immediate legal liability on day 1 of this merger. Furthermore, when we evaluated CloudNet's data center infrastructure across 30 state markets, we discovered that their physical facilities required specialized high-voltage engineering maintenance that Brandon's automated software platform was completely unequipped to manage. Replacing hands-on senior technical supervisors with generic remote contractors would have exposed our critical data nodes to catastrophic power outages, triggering millions of dollars in liquidated damages under our master service agreements. Brandon's face flushed crimson. That is a minor administrative compliance detail that can be handled by middle management labor attorneys after the closing. We are here to vote on an $850 million acquisition that will elevate our stock valuation by 30%. Administrative compliance? Victor Bradley, one of our longest-tenured board members, interjected, opening the blue folder I had provided. Victor adjusted his reading glasses and leaned toward the speaker monitor. Raymond is entirely correct, Brandon. As a former federal appellate judge, I can assure you that federal courts view fraudulent performance evaluation schemes designed to bypass Title 29 of the United States Code with severe hostility. If we execute mass terminations under this disguised scheme, we will trigger mandatory federal Department of Labor investigations, federal compliance audits, and immediate class action litigations from affected workers. That is not all, I continued, turning to page 14 of the audit document. Brandon's acquisition structure relies upon transferring core proprietary software algorithms from CloudNet directly into our cloud architecture within 72 hours of closing. However, our independent intellectual property audit reveals that CloudNet does not possess unencumbered ownership of those software modules. Those modules contain third-party licensed code protected under Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code, the Copyright Act. Executing this transfer without secondary licensing rights constitutes deliberate copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, exposing us to statutory damages of up to $150,000 per willful infringement. Brandon slammed both fists onto the mahogany table, rattling the crystal water glasses and causing Sarah to recoil slightly. This is absurd. You are weaponizing obscure legal statutes and technicalities because your feelings were hurt when I declined your handshake. You are sabotaging an $850 million transaction out of personal spite. My feelings are entirely irrelevant, Brandon, I answered, keeping my voice dead, even, and authoritative. As a member of this board of directors, I owe a strict fiduciary duty of care and fiduciary duty of loyalty to our shareholders under Delaware corporate law. Approving an acquisition riddled with Federal Warren Act violations under Title 29, copyright infringement risks under Title 17, and unhedged customer churn would be a flagrant breach of my fiduciary duties. Under Delaware legal precedents regarding Caremark corporate compliance obligations, board members face personal liability if they ignore red flags, and I have zero intention of permitting an arrogant rookie CEO to burn down 32 years of enterprise value in 90 minutes. Harrison Miller leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fountain pen against his notepad. The legal exposure Raymond has outlined is not theoretical, Brandon. Under Delaware General Corporation Law Section 141, our board of directors is legally obligated to exercise active oversight and due diligence. Ignoring explicit statutory violations of federal labor law and copyright statutes would expose every single member of this board to personal breach of fiduciary duty lawsuits from institutional investors. Then call for the vote. Brandon shouted, his composure completely disintegrating. The management team supports this deal. Harrison, put the acquisition to a board vote right now. Harrison Miller looked around the table. The board members were scrutinizing the legal documents in front of them with expressionless, stern faces. Before Harrison could speak, I picked up my mobile phone. "That will not be necessary, Brandon," I said calmly. "What are you doing?" Brandon demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "I am exercising my rights as an 18% shareholder under Section 12.4 of the Apex Core Technologies Corporate Governance Bylaws," I announced. Section 12.4 contains our mandatory shareholder rights plan, commonly known in corporate legal jurisprudence as the poison pill provision, validated under Delaware General Corporation Law Section 141, and established Delaware Chancery Court legal precedents such as Moran v. Household International and Unocal Corporation v. Mesa Petroleum. Sarah Jenkins gasped quietly, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard to bring up the governing corporate charter on her primary display screen. Under Section 12.4, I continued into the silent room. Any founding shareholder retaining over 15% of voting stock who identifies active statutory noncompliance, material misrepresentation, or gross fiduciary breach in a proposed transaction has the absolute unilateral authority to trigger an immediate mandatory suspension of all pending mergers, pending an emergency board review of executive conduct. I hit speakerphone and dialed the direct emergency line of our senior corporate legal counsel, Attorney Franklin Davis. The line rang twice before Attorney Davis answered. "This is Attorney Franklin Davis. Legal Counsel Office. Franklin, this is Raymond Vance, I said into the clear speakerphone. I am exercising Shareholder Authorization Code, Romeo Victor, 7749 under Section 12.4 of our bylaws. I am placing an immediate governance freeze on the CloudNet Solutions acquisition proposal effective immediately. Attorney Davis paused briefly, the sound of legal databases searching through the line. Authorization Code Romeo Victor 7749 verified. Pursuant to Delaware law and Section 12.4 of your governance charter, all acquisition proceedings, public filings, and transaction signatures are officially frozen for 48 hours. Management is instructed to cease all external deal communications immediately. Thank you, Franklin, I said, and disconnected the call. The conference room was enveloped in a stunned, breathless silence. Brandon stood frozen, staring at my phone as if it were a deadly weapon that had just discharged in his face. His confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by a pale, sweat-sheened look of terror. "You cannot do this to me!" Brandon screamed, his voice echoing frantically off the glass windows. "I am the chief executive officer of this company. You are just a retired advisor sitting in a legacy chair." "Actually, Brandon," Harrison Miller said, his voice dropping into the solemn, unyielding tone of a board chairman executing corporate discipline, "under Section 12.4 of our governing charter, the moment a poison pill governance freeze is executed, the chief executive officer is automatically suspended from participating in board deliberations. You are legally required to vacate this room immediately, while the board conducts an emergency executive evaluation." Brandon looked desperately around the mahogany table, searching the eyes of Sarah Jenkins, Victor Bradley, Evelyn Carter, Douglas Ross, and Cynthia Brooks for a single lifeline of support. Every single director looked back at him with cold, impassioned detachment. They had watched him scoff at a founder's handshake, dismiss federal compliance laws, brand senior employees as over 45 liabilities, and attempt to rush an $850 million deal containing severe legal liabilities. "Grab your presentation materials and leave the room, Brandon," Harrison ordered sternly. Brandon grabbed his wireless remote and leather folder with trembling hands. As he walked toward the heavy oak exit door, he turned back, his face contorted in anger. "You will all regret this. This company cannot survive without my strategic vision." The oak door slammed shut behind him with a heavy, reverberating thud. The moment the door closed, Harrison Miller looked at the board members. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in an emergency executive governance session. Per our charter, we will review the full unedited livestream recording of today's meeting from the beginning. For the next 45 minutes, the board watched the high-definition video feed on the presentation screens. They watched Brandon refuse my extended hand with contempt. They heard him explicitly declare that human respect and employee retention were obsolete concepts. They listened as he casually dismissed Federal Warren Act compliance under Title 29 of the United States Code and copyright law, under Title 17 of the United States Code. While the board conducted its initial review, our corporate legal team, under attorney Franklin Davis, performed an emergency forensic audit of Brandon's private acquisition files and electronic correspondence. What they uncovered within 2 hours transformed a governance dispute into a catastrophic executive scandal. Attorney Franklin Davis walked into the boardroom at 4:15 p.m. with a thick stack of verified documentation. "Board members, our legal audit has uncovered material misrepresentations that violate Section 10B and Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Brandon Hayes entered into a secret side agreement with CloudNet's principal founders. In exchange for pushing through the inflated $850 million valuation, CloudNet agreed to allocate $10 million in private equity options to an offshore shell holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, controlled secretly by Brandon's immediate family members. Furthermore, he suppressed internal accounting reports showing that CloudNet harbored $50 million in unrecorded toxic debt and pending environmental liabilities. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Evelyn Carter covered her mouth in shock, while Douglas Ross shook his head in utter disbelief. "That constitutes gross breach of the fiduciary duty of loyalty," criminal securities fraud under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, and intentional self-dealing, Attorney Davis concluded. When Attorney Franklin Davis finished summarizing the forensic evidence, the entire room sat in absolute silence for several long moments. Victor Bradley took off his glasses, polished them slowly with a microfiber cloth, and looked directly at Harrison Miller. "In my 25 years on the judicial bench," Victor remarked solemnly, "I have rarely witnessed such an egregious combination of executive hubris, fiduciary betrayal, and reckless contempt for the law. Terminating Brandon Hayes is not merely a legal option. It is an urgent moral imperative for this board." Harrison Miller immediately raised his hand. "I call for a formal motion to terminate Brandon Hayes as Chief Executive Officer of Apex Core Technologies, effective immediately for cause, based on gross fiduciary breach, fraud, and statutory violations." "Seconded," Victor Bradley stated firmly. Harrison called for the vote. "All in favor?" 7 hands went up instantly. Even Cynthia Brooks, who had initially sought a 30-day review period, raised her hand after reviewing the evidence of self-dealing. The vote was unanimous. 7-0 at 5:20 p.m. Corporate security officers entered Brandon's corner office, presented him with the formal board termination order signed by Harrison Miller, and escorted him out of the building. His 18-month reign of arrogance was over. The news of Brandon's immediate termination and the suspension of the CloudNet acquisition broke across major financial networks by 6 o'clock that evening. CNBC aired a breaking bulletin titled, "Corporate Governance Payback at Apex Core." Bloomberg terminal alerts flashed across thousands of trading screens. Apex founder triggers poison pill to oust CEO after governance breakdown. Wall Street Journal reporters published an in-depth analysis detailing how an arrogant chief executive officer tried to steamroll corporate governance and statutory compliance, only to be stopped in his tracks by seasoned leadership. In the days that followed, business journalists and commentators analyzed the incident relentlessly. Wall Street analysts initially questioned whether the company would suffer destabilization. But when Harrison Miller announced that Sarah Jenkins had been appointed permanent chief executive officer and that I had agreed to serve as active executive chairman of the board, investor confidence soared. Our stock price, which had briefly dropped during the initial announcement, rebounded by 12% within 48 hours, reaching historic all-time highs. Under Sarah's pragmatic and ethical leadership, we completely restructured the CloudNet transaction. Instead of executing an aggressive, debt-ridden $850 million takeover accompanied by illegal mass firings, we negotiated a streamlined strategic technology merger valued at $520 million. We retained CloudNet's 50 senior engineers, honoring their decades of institutional knowledge and integrating them into our primary research and development divisions. We established a comprehensive internal mentorship initiative, pairing senior engineers over 45 with talented junior developers, fostering an environment where experienced wisdom guided cutting-edge innovation. 3 of those senior engineers, whom Brandon had branded as legacy liabilities over 45, went on to invent our next-generation quantum-encrypted cloud architecture module. That single innovation saved our company over 18 months of development time, secured 10 joint patents, and generated $1.2 billion in new enterprise contract value over the following 3 years. As for Brandon Hayes, his corporate career lay in absolute ruin. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a formal enforcement investigation into his undisclosed private equity side agreements under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Rule 10b-5. The board reached a comprehensive civil settlement that stripped him of all unvested stock options and forced him to disgorge his executive bonuses under Section 304 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Today, he works as a mid-level contractor for a boutique advisory firm in Boston, banned forever from holding an executive office in any publicly traded corporation. 1 year after that fateful Tuesday, I was invited to give the keynote address at the National Corporate Governance Summit in Chicago. The auditorium was packed with over 2,000 corporate leaders, veteran founders, and young ambitious executives from across the country. When I stepped up to the podium, I looked out at the audience and recalled the moment Brandon refused my hand on the 47th floor. In our relentless pursuit of technological disruption and financial speed, I told the audience, we must never confuse arrogance with leadership, nor mistake experience for obsolescence. True corporate power is not measured by how ruthlessly you can discard the people who built the foundation beneath your feet. It is measured by your unwavering commitment to integrity, legal compliance, and basic human dignity. I paused, looking at a group of young Master of Business Administration graduates sitting in the front row. Innovation without a foundation of respect is merely expensive chaos, I continued. Never forget that the people who built your industry did not become foolish simply because they accumulated gray hair. Respect costs nothing, but the lack of it will cost you everything you have spent your life trying to build. When I finished my speech, the entire auditorium rose to their feet in a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. Younger executives and veteran board members alike cheered together, celebrating a timeless truth that no modern algorithm can ever erase. Today, the leather briefcase I carried into the boardroom that Tuesday morning rests on a wooden shelf in my executive chairman office. Inside it, alongside our corporate governance charter and Section 12.4 poison pill provisions, sits a framed photograph of our original 12-person team from 1991. Every time a newly hired young executive enters my office for their orientation, I stand up, walk across the room with a genuine smile, and extend my right hand. And every time they shake my hand with warmth and mutual respect, I know that the soul of this company is completely secure. Arrogance may occasionally win a temporary battle, but integrity, hard-earned wisdom, and unwavering respect will always reign supreme in the end. Looking back on that stormy Tuesday in Chicago, I realized that our corporate saga was never merely about saving an $850 million deal or outmaneuvering an arrogant young chief executive officer. It was about defining the fundamental principles by which modern businesses ought to be governed. In a business world increasingly obsessed with automated metrics and rapid disruption, we prove that human character, statutory integrity, and mutual respect remain the ultimate competitive advantages. The governance safeguards we embedded into our corporate charter did not just save 5,000 jobs. They preserved the moral foundation of an enterprise that thousands of families depend upon every day. As I look out my office window at Lake Michigan, I know that true leadership will always be built upon the timeless foundation of honor, wisdom, and an honest handshake.